It was some year in the future when humanity fell. The end came fast and left the survivors building slender societies around the remnants of their once great civilization. And from that wasteland of civilization rose a new society. But what was the shape of this post-apocalyptic society? How did it come to be? What were the factors that influenced how leaders became leaders and how resources were divided? That is what I want to talk about today. Things to think about when building a post-apocalyptic society. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. This video is sponsored by Worldbuilding, a set of world-building tools that helps you create, manage, and store your world setting. One of the common causes of apocalypse is a virus-type infection or some kind of condition that affects people. And World Anvil has got a great template for tracking conditions, for creating them and storing them as part of your world. The template asks you questions like, what is the epidemiology? How can it be treated? How fast does it spread? And you can choose what type of condition you want this to be. Everything from biological to fungal to magical to divine. So if you want to use World Anvil, you can sign up for free using the link below. And if you're ready to move to the premium model, you can use my link to get a 10% discount. Thank you very much to World Anvil for sponsoring my content. And also for hosting my world, the Sangwheel Chronicles, which you can check out on the links below. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. When you're setting up a post-apocalyptic setting, the first thing to think about is, of course, what caused the apocalypse. Now, I already did a video on the causes of the apocalypse, which you can check out on the information card. In this video, I'm assuming the worst has happened, the apocalypse has happened, and humanity now needs to pick itself up. So we are very shortly after the actual apocalyptic events in the timeline of post-apocalyptic worlds. So the first thing to consider is, how would leaders arise in this situation? You have a bunch of confused people stumbling around in the ruins of their lives, in the ruins of their civilization, looking for any kind of leadership. If you had a strong government that existed before the apocalypse, and remnants of it still exist after the apocalypse, so you still have some military structures, etc., it is very easy for a military junta-type dictatorship to arise as your leadership in this post-apocalyptic world. A great example of that is the rise of Fedra in the video game and the TV adaptation, The Last of Us. So in The Last of Us, the apocalypse is caused by fungus that takes over people's brains, a la the fungus that takes over the brains of ants that I covered in my video on fungus in a fantasy world. These fungi now take over human brains and people basically turn into infected zombies. There is a US government organization called Fedra that takes over the United States government and declares martial law. At first, it makes, I suppose, sense, and I suppose they were trying to, honestly contain the situation and save as much of humanity as they could, but obviously it slid into fascism really fast. So Fedra set up these QZs, these quarantine zones, in all the major cities of the United States. And people lived inside these quarantine zones, and if you entered the quarantine zone, then you have to go through a test to see if you were infected or not. Now, by the time that the episode is upon us, the first episode of The Last of Us, Fedra have pretty much become a pretty heinous organization that if you show any signs of infection, they don't just return you to the wilds or whatever, they euthanize you, no matter what your age is. And that kind of slide into fascism is very typical, I think, of what would happen in a post-apocalyptic environment, because you have a bunch of people who have been grouped together and who were used to much greater freedoms. Remember, these people weren't born into this kind of society. They were used to a free and open society before the apocalypse. Then the apocalypse happens, and now they're in this society where it is absolute control over their movements. So, of course, this gives rise to resistance, which you see in The Last of Us as well, in the organization known as the Fireflies, who are resisting the Fedra government. This kind of government in a post-apocalyptic world offers you, the storyteller, some fantastic setups. You can have your protagonists be rebels who are fighting against the military dictatorship. Or if you're running a role-playing game, your players can be part of this rebel alliance. Or if you want, you can flip that on its head and say, well, actually, there is a good reason why this military is in charge. Maybe resources really are that scarce. And your protagonists can be part of the organization that is keeping this military dictatorship in place. And they have to do these terrible things because what they're fighting against is worse. And then you start playing around with the very interesting themes around, do the ends justify the means? And that then becomes the question that your setting asks. But such kinds of leadership generally only arises if you had some of your previous government survive. So what if you didn't? What if nothing of the old society survives? What kind of leadership will there be in such a society? So you have two kind of broad options here. You're probably either going to go with a kind of Wild West bandit style of leadership and society, where you have small, isolated steadfasts, you know, that run on kind of family principles, like the family farm and so on. And then you're going to have bandit groups. And these bandit groups are going to be the kind of worst of the worst, who steal from any travelers who go through their territory, who sometimes even raid your steedings and your farms and so on. Your setup in that kind of society is very much a lawless society, and one where stealing is rife and people die young, and you need, gunfighters to kind of keep the peace, and you need to have like armored caravans traveling between towns and that kind of setup. Of course, you can have bandits and have the military junta, because you can have the military junta in control of like the cities, but you can still have bandits out in the hinterlands preying on people who choose not to live in the cities. And the other type of government that you can have, that you can also combine with your bandits, but not necessarily with your military juntas, is warlords. So warlords are like Mad Max Fury Road's Immortal Joe. So these are guys who, through their mythos, have gathered around them like this force of bad guys, and they keep them in check with almost like ritualistic aspects, not necessarily magic, more like being in a cult. They formed a cult of personality around them through which they control these really bad men. And basically they bring people into this cult. They dominate the environment around them and basically form a one-man dictatorship. If you want to have an unambiguously evil government, warlords are a great way to go. I don't think there's anybody who was rooting for Immortal Joe to win in Mad Max Fury Road. And if you enjoyed that discussion of the leadership types that can arise after a post-apocalypse, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about the resources that these leaderships would control and why those resources matter. So firstly, of course, people need to see to their basic needs. This means they need food, they need water, they need shelter. Now, clean water could potentially be a really, really scarce resource depending on what happened during your apocalypse and the effect that it had on the environment. If, for example, your apocalypse created a scorched environment, so an environment kind of like a very desert-like environment, water is a problem. If it created a frozen environment, you could in theory melt the ice as long as it's not irradiated. So it depends on what kind of environment was created after the apocalypse happened as to how hard basic needs are to meet. For example, if you have zombies running around on what would be arable farmland, then you need to have guards who are in place to keep those zombies out of your farmlands and allow your farmers to farm. And that sort of organization means you're definitely looking at either a warlord type setup or a military junta type setup in order to protect the agricultural environment to give you food resources. And then building shelter could be quite a difficult task as well, because not only do you have to build shelter, but potentially you have to build fortifications and defenses against monsters that could be roaming around in the countryside. You could have mutated monsters who are, stalking around the place looking for prey, and your cities and holdings and towns and houses need to take that into consideration. And if you'd like to check out my opinion on fortifications in fantasy worlds, I made a video about that. You can check it out in the card above. So those are kind of basic needs that you need to address in this post-apocalyptic society. But you have one resource in any post-apocalypse society that really gets people very antsy about who controls it and how you can use it. And that is the technology of the fallen civilization. So first there is straight up scavenging of that technology. Who is allowed to do that and how can you do that? The Last of Us in episode 1, season 1 shows this very well when Joel needs to get that car battery. And a large part of the episode is his trying to get the car battery, and then the car battery doesn't work. And without a car battery, you can't start a car. So you need to scavenge that part in order to make your old technology work. That kind of scavenging can form a fantastic way of bringing conflict into your story. Your protagonists might need a specific piece of technology in order to make another piece work. Can they get it from legitimate sources? Is there an underground that handles technology as there is in The Last of Us? Maybe there is scrap heaps of technology out in dangerous locations, and you can go on a whole epic journey to go to that location, find that piece of technology, and bring it back to your society. So that then becomes a whole quest on itself to go and scavenge that technology. So scavenging for technology is definitely a thing that you can introduce in a post-apocalyptic world in order to bring about people trying to gain control of old tech resources. But what you also need to remember is that in a post-apocalyptic world, people might be dealing with technology that they no longer understand, especially if, say, you've maybe had a generation past, and then people start interacting with the technology, and they could enact some kind of ritual that then activates the technology and gives them access to resources. But they don't realize that all they're doing is activating the ritual. And when that happens, you can get a cargo cult arising. So a cargo cult basically comes down to believing that if you do certain types of things, you will get certain resources. The things that you do and the resources that you get are not necessarily that directly related. It's just that it appears that way to the person doing them. And cargo cults are very interesting because you can take it to a max extreme and have things like in Warhammer 40k, where you say a prayer to the machine spirit of your gun to make sure that it works. But what you're actually doing is doing the ritual of maintenance. You're actually cleaning the gun and ensuring that it's oiled and checking its part for maintenance. But the person doing it calls it the prayer to the machine spirit. I will talk more about Warhammer 40k in my post-apocalyptic world, so if you haven't yet subscribe if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on such a world. So you can also play around with people not understanding the technology anymore. I mean, if the world went into an actual apocalypse now, in 10 years, how many people would remember how advanced technology works? And would it become a superstitious act to use something that still keeps working, but you don't know how it works? So you just do these things that you've been taught to do because you've been taught to do them without understanding how they work at all, which is always an interesting thing to play around with in terms of how your readers or how your players experience your world. And the last thing to consider about who has old tech is that maybe, like, manufacturing of old technology is still happening. And again, you can see this in both The Last of Us and in Mad Max Fury Road, specifically around bullets. So in The Last of Us, there's a passing reference to the factory in Atlanta where they produce bullets for guns. And in Mad Max Fury Road, you have bullets and gas both forming a central part of the resources that you need to have in order to have a functioning society. And if you're going to keep using guns post-apocalypse, you do need bullets. And that could mean that having access to a factory, a place where you can make old technology resources, could be an incredible resource in and of itself that people would be willing to fight over. So controlling those factories could become a point of conflict for your stories. And if you enjoyed that discussion of resources, the environment, and their potential use in your story and your world, hit the thumbs up button. So if you are designing a post-apocalyptic society, what are the things that you should think about? Firstly, who controls the resources? Do you have a fascist military government? Do you have warlords? Do you have a lawless environment where people only control the tiny amounts around their own farms? And what story elements do each of those allow you to explore? How do people interact with old tech? Do they scavenge? Do they have factories? Are they cargo cults? Do they have rituals associated with it? And of course, what is the environment like? And what resources does that offer to the people who live in this environment? And those are my thoughts on a post-apocalyptic society. If you enjoyed this video, maybe check out my video on how to use technology as magic. And if you want to connect around this or any other topic, remember that I do have a Discord server linked down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.